We have invited Iketina Danso to be here with us today. Iketina is an intersectional equalities specialist, a human rights practitioner, and a human resources expert. She lectures in anti-discrimination and equality as part of the Applied Human Rights Master's program at the Vienna University of Applied Arts, and she's also chair of the association HINT Wien, highly intersectional Vienna. She's also a communities poet at Villa Vida Queer Cafe, and she writes with the pen name J.G. Danso, and just published a book of poems. Her multidisciplinary approach pushes for structural equality, intersectionality, and inclusion in all spaces. She's born in East London and to parents from Ghana and Sierra Leone, and she's currently based in Vienna and has thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today. The floor is all yours.
Okay, let's check the mic. That was the one thing I didn't check. Good morning, everyone. Hi. And glad you got your cup of tea, even in Vienna. Welcome, everybody. Okie doke. And thank you, Educult, for having me here to speak to the topic of inequalities in urban arts education. I've often been in the position of writing keynote speeches for others, and so to write my own keynote speech is a real pleasure, and this is a topic that's super important to me and to all of us, so it's beautiful to bring people together to be talking about it. How do I begin a keynote speech when it's my first keynote speech ever, so be kind? I'm starting with me. So, I don't know if you can see that, it's a little bit tiny. My name is Iketina Danso, and these are my parents with me on my christening on our housing estate in East London when I was I guess I look about 6 months old. So my dad is from Ghana and my mother is from Sierra Leone. They met in London. They divorced after 2 years, but that's maybe a different keynote speech. And they christened me Iketina Ama Asantewa Danso. And Asantewa is after the Ashanti warrior queen, who led an army of first exclusively women to fight against the British. And it was known as the Battle of the Golden Stool, because after capturing the Ashanti king, the British demanded the Golden Stool, which was a symbol of the soul of the Ashanti kingdom, and still is. That Queen Ya Asantewa refused to hand over the stool and led the women of Ashanti to war. And so today I stand here as a queer black woman, mother poet, human rights practitioner, and quite conflict averse, actually, arts educator, inspired by an Ashanti warrior queen. And so I will quote one of my favorite queer black woman, mother poet, human rights practitioner, arts educator, and unapologetic warrior queen, Audre Lorde. And she said, "Poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams toward survival and change, first made into language, then into an idea, then into more tangible action." And this is the power of poetry. In fact, this is the power of art. And so urban arts, culture, and arts education are not luxuries. We are living in an age of persistent and entrenched inequality, exacerbated by climate crises, by war, some wars considered more important and more of a priority than others, some conflicts remembered, too many forgotten, living with the consequences of patriarchal violence against women and femmes, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and other forms of structural harm and exclusion, all put in a package of glossy 24-hour communications newsreel that normalizes these events as almost an inevitability deep within our inner psyches, leading to burnout, mental health problems, erasure, human rights breaches, and massive inequalities. And so it's in this context that I will be talking about access to arts and culture education in urban environments as a source of respite, as a way to deconstruct, to reimagine, as a way to nourish mental health. And these are not luxuries at all. In fact, these put y'all as arts educators really on the front lines. So another picture of me with my little brother. You can see the red bricks. This is us again at home outside our estate. And so when it comes to inclusion, I'm here to represent or present my perspective and my experiences and those of people who look like me, who grew up like me. There were many of us, and my arts education began at home. Elegant busts of heads carved in dark wood, drums hanging on a wall, the tribal scars on my father's face, West African art souvenirs carried carefully in excess baggage. There was always excess baggage. When the privilege of a Commonwealth passport still got you into Europe with a scheduled flight. No longer the case. So for many of us, especially those of us with what they like to call in Austria migration backgrounds, who grew up in crowded homes and loving homes, on limited incomes, we have these stories and we have these artifacts from home, connected to the journeys of our parents, of our families, of our friends, of our loved ones. And I would say my earliest canvas were the urban streets of London. Street art of East London, modern calligraphy of the 1980s, at the time called vandalism, rather than street art as it is now. Bhangra blasting out from car stereos, Bollywood movies, trainer fashion, and saris blowing in the rain. Enthusiastic art teachers at my local school. And once the school curriculum pushed my arts education into local and free access galleries, and we were really lucky to be able to, I count myself very lucky to have been able to experience that growing up. That was a real privilege. This makeup was dominated by legacy institutions, as I call them, and national fine art collections. Museums built with the profit of exploiting my ancestors, a fact never really mentioned, and showing works that sometimes looked very much like what I had at home. However, Africans were never really mentioned as any creative protagonists. And European art institutions that I experienced from childhood into adulthood never really mentioned how these African works appeared there in Holborn or on the Ringstrasse. I was taught to revere European names as exceptional talents, as originals, as true genius. And from my own children, I know that 30 years later, experience of school arts education and friends who I have at university level studying in fine arts colleges and schools, not much has changed in the way of that preparation, and it's still far too easy for well-resourced institutions and arts education policymakers to consider inclusion as optional, and it isn't. But they rely very heavily on ad hoc events that fizzle out and then look suspiciously performative. National policymakers in arts and culture cannot continue to sit back and expect these institutions to self-regulate when it comes to inclusion in urban spaces, because that tends to mean doing the bare minimum and avoiding mentioning things, lots of things, when it comes to inclusion. So in order to be genuinely inclusive, we need to come together and explore new ways to educate about the histories of artworks and their relevance to diverse communities now, today, and there are many points of connection and relevance. So with this picture is an example of using new tools and new ways of learning, and I'm really happy to say that I was recently part of a flash podium at the Kunstforum organized by Creative Human Rights Practices, a new association who came together through the Angewandte Applied Human Rights Program. And it was a very courageous format of bringing in voices to critique the works on the wall spontaneously, and this time it was Helmut Newton, so a high-profile, rebellious, and quite controversial figure. And I think he would approve. And I also think that Schiele would approve, or Klimt, as they were leaders of their time in pushing buttons. And right now, it's February, and so it's Black History Month in Vienna, and this is something that came through the US but has been adopted here, and many organizations are organizing events around Black History Month. But it's really just the past couple of years that it's become more visible here. I know from the UK we do October, because we've always got to be a little bit different. But the rest, we're following the US program here and going with February as Black History Month. So how many of the organizations you work for have reached out to Black organizations in Vienna, and not just in February, but all year? And what's been happening with your programming when it comes to Black History Month? Inclusion policy still has a lot to do to catch up with the realities of urban demographics in Austria, in Vienna, in urban spaces. What's this one? Oh, yeah. So this is me reading outside the Villa Vida Cafe, where I'm communities poet. And so when I think about physical and ideological spaces, and when you're talking in your workshops about ideological and physical spaces, when I was growing up, there were classrooms full of kids like me with my life story. In comparable districts of Vienna, in urban spaces, many families with artifacts at home and conversations around art who aren't seeing themselves in arts institutions once they leave their homes. Many spaces like where I grew up in London or in Manchester or, many of the cities, Klagenfurt, Linz. And as you know from my bio, which I was very well introduced, following my beginnings in London, I've worked 20 years in public policy, and I continue to be shaped by grassroots anti-racism work, intersectional equality and human rights policy work, the work I do with young artists and people working in policy as a lecturer at the Applied Human Rights Programme, queer community storytelling events and initiatives organised by the association I founded, Hint Wien, Highly Intersectional Vienna, especially our monthly Queer Writers Circle, and some of you all are here who've been, so it's lovely to see. And there I facilitate these conversations and interactions and try to create spaces of exchange and energy and learning around what arts and culture really means in urban spaces. And I do this work as a resident poet of Villa Vida, the Queer Cafe. And I also work with Schwarze Frauenverein, Schwarze Frauen Community, as a board member where we support Black kids, young people and their families in Vienna. I think I've got a picture. That's me. We're having a workshop on the LGBTQIA intersections and experiences with Blackness in Vienna. These are youth workers and folk who create programming for young people who are in Black families, and this looks like many, many, many versions of what that is. And so I was reading my first book, 1,000 Ships, which is an illustrated poem. The other book is coming, reader. Where are you? You've plugged it for me before it's written. So the pressure is on now. So I say this to give context, that I really know that in environments similar to where I came from, there are many, many of us with a story similar to mine, trying to access arts education, shape decision-making. I'm not an exception. And yet, whether it's been in human rights organizations, academia, or arts and culture organizations, the further along I got in my career, the fewer folk I saw who look like me, especially in leadership, in programming, in development, and in decision-making. So where did everyone go? It's not an issue of talent. It's an issue of access. Or maybe they went into the metaverse because technology is shaping and right now shapes the ideological and physical access to arts and cultural experiences increasingly is something that we cannot ignore as arts educators. AI is here to stay, for better or for worse, whether you like it or not. And this poses a question and a challenge to us as arts educators in urban spaces. How do we bring everyone with us into the metaverse from day one? How do we avoid building new worlds through old models of imperialism, theft, and exploitation? How do we ensure that the virtual cultural spaces are more accessible and more inclusive than what we know so far? When it comes to access, ideological and physical, we must avoid replicating old systems of inequality. So as arts educators, we need to speak and think expansively, and be ready to have some uncomfortable conversations around what ethical practices for arts and culture spaces look like today in our spaces, but also for the future. So, of course, like arts educators need support to do this. And it was really exciting to hear what EduCult has been doing in terms of building new tools and new ways of learning and exploring how we can connect and how different people learn and develop when it comes to arts and culture. This is what will lead to inclusion. And whether arts educators are within formal institutions or not, we need to give a peace of mind for those who really have this intimate knowledge and understanding and sensitivity of what are often unseen and marginalized communities at intersections of so much. We need to have support of arts educators to have the peace of mind to tell the truth, to be truth tellers, to say uncomfortable things and yet feel safe enough in your job and resourced enough to be able to do this without fear of retaliation. And retaliation can look like a lot of things. It can look like withdrawn funding. It can look like unsupported program proposals. It can look like microaggressions for speaking up. And educators must be brought in that represent all colours, abilities, classes and identities. So it makes sense that there will always be some element of arts education that is outside of institutions and formal organisations, that will stay at a grassroots and community level. This is really important. And as I mentioned, arts urban spaces must experiment with new formats and tools, like EduCult has already been doing so well, to keep art relevant to different audiences, to validate experiences and histories and connect these histories to learning, to identities and to intersections of different experiences. And not all these tools are digital and online, thank goodness. Here is an example in this photograph of learning through the power of play in a more traditional format. It's a board game called Ticket to Safety. Again, it's an initiative that I came into contact with through the Angewandte Applied Arts in Human Rights program. And it uses the power of play to change mindsets around building empathy on the topic of migration, asylum, climate change, and safety worldwide. And arts and culture must have the resources to experiment, to work with practitioners of different types, who have expertise and bravery to take the risk to reimagine how we educate and support arts education in urban spaces. And this will take some leadership within these institutions, as I said, for the psychological safety to be able to speak your mind and speak up when we see that folks are missing, to bring them in, to connect with communities and to invite in critical analysis and build spaces of mutual learning. So what does this mean when it comes to the exploration of multilingualism and metrolingualism? How will we develop new ways to interact with messages of art through art? So I talked about new formats of discussion and about play. And as a poet, I will now talk about poetry as a way to do that. And you might not expect it because of the language limitations or barriers of words. However, poetry is really a tool that transcends language. And Hint Wien has a queer writer circle. We meet once a month, another plug. And it's multilingual and welcomes every language. And in principle, you can speak any language and translation is never required, although most people prefer to work in English. We are going to be preparing a poetry book, which would be multilingual. And in November 2022, I organised the first highly intersectional queer-centred storytelling festival for queer writers and allies called Poetic Intuition. That's what this photo is. We had poetry recitals in Bangla, in German, in Greek, in English, and from the Sufi traditions. Right, Uishi? Didn't we? We did. Uishi was a massive help in preparing that. And we understood each other. The power of poetry is an intangible connection. There was no translation necessary, just a bit of an intro, then you read your thing, and then a bit of an outro to give context. But the words of the poetry, be it in Bangla or Greek or from Sufi tradition, didn't need translating. And such connections formed in art spaces enable us to dream and reimagine beyond what we know as the systems that are broken now. We need more of such experiences in all art spaces and for all ages and for all educators to be integrated into urban arts education, and we need it more urgently than ever. So arts educators, we must continue to work with diverse contributors and build dynamic spaces of mutual learning that keep art and culture development open and accessible to all, affordable. You know, the ticket prices in Vienna are a bit of an ouch if you're a family of 3. Or even if you're, on a budget generally. This is really a policy issue and an accessibility issue and an inclusion issue. Why pay to see stuff that's not actually been paid to be purchased in the first place? We need to think about what kind of a message that sends out into the world about how we see who is valued and whose histories are recognized, and what violence means and is and looks like, and how we're going to heal and repair from that place. And so arts educators, this is very complex work and will need support in order to hold funders and institutions to account on these points. It's interdisciplinary work, it's holistic work. It needs to have resources, monitoring, evaluations, and accountability. This is actually the book that I've brought out so far, my illustrated poetry book. And so to close, I will repeat that I am a queer black woman, mother poet, whose parents named her after an Ashanti warrior queen. And so to close this keynote, I will actually use the opening words to my book, 1,000 Ships, which is an illustrated poetry book written to honor the legacy of Marsha P. Johnson, a queer activist and to whom we owe so much, not only in queer community, but on a day like today, romance and Valentine's, somebody who fought for love and the human right to love freely and fairly and beautifully. And I opened the poem with, to all we were, all we are, and all we will become. We have always been here, there, and everywhere. Onwards into the expanse. Thank you.